So I've made a selection of a few of these stories, actually 25 of them, since it is, of course, Denise, so the proper number of stories is 25. I will not read all of them today. Uh, they might appear sometime later on, but you can find them also on the Sign chat. I have a link to them as well. For tonight, I have selected five of the stories. So let's see how far we get. And they are stories about people you haven't heard about, often people with no names, just like in the fairy tales from our world, where we don't really know people's names. We don't really know the name of the two brothers with the magical gifts. We don't know the name of an old man who finds a fairy or who finds an ogre or who finds a magical frog. But the stories still stay with us. So the first story I have for tonight is, I think, one of Nosila's favorites. It's a story called The Library of Glass, and it is inspired in a way. It has some similarity with some of the stories from the Grimm's fairy tales bundles, and also some old-fashioned religious stories as well. So let's begin with the first story for tonight. Okay, you can all hear me, I think, right? You've all been saying things, so I think you can all hear me. Okay, let's begin. Long ago, in the days when Rinnerev ruled over the city, the Ni was plagued by earthquakes. The age was new and the city was still small, so that every tremor caused great destruction. During one of these disasters, a poor girl was caught in the destruction, and as she lived in a small house built of packed earth and rocks, she lost all that she had. She ran and ran, and without seeing where she went, as the ground shook, the walls of the cavern cracked and fell in pieces into the lake, and the city collapsed around her. Narrowly escaping the falling rocks, the girl reached the shores of the lake. Now, the lake in those days was not tame and well-traveled as it is today. Remember, the Denis storyteller is telling this at a time when Denis is still alive. It was wild and an empty place that filled men's hearts with fear. So when the girl saw a boat come towards her across the water, a boat pulled by a single rower, tall and grey, she was filled with dread. When the boat came close, she saw that it was full of the spirits of the dead, who stared ahead with empty eyes. The boatman smiled warmly but said nothing, and he rowed his boat further down the lake into the darkness, leaving the shore shrouded in mist. When the mist lifted, the girl saw another boat come towards the shore, but this boat was empty and made all of silver. She stepped aboard, and it carried her away, gliding silently across the water with no sail and no oars. The silver boat carried the girl far away from the collapsing city, until not a sound could still be heard, and around her she saw nothing but swirling mist. Then from the fog rose a glittering mountain, made all of glass, and here the boat stopped. The girl stepped onto the glassy shore and found a door in the side of the mountain, and behind that door a library. She looked about her in wonder, as this library was unlike any in the city, for it was made all of glass. Glass staircases spiraled up to glass galleries. She saw her face reflected in 1,000 glassy walls. Light fell everywhere from 1,000 glass lamps, and all the pages of all the books were not paper but crystal. Amazed, the girl wandered from floor to floor, until she became quite lost. Just as she was about to sit down and cry in despair, she saw a door made of a wood so rough it seemed to be the living bark of a tree. Before it stood two motionless stone watchmen. One made all of garnet, the other made all of sapphire. "Go no further, girl," they said, "for behind this door lies the glory of the tree of possibilities, which none may look upon and live." At this the girl wished for nothing more than to look through the door. "Just one glimpse," she said to herself. "That's all I ask." And so she spoke to the stone watchman. "I come from Denis, greatest of all cities. But an earthquake came and destroyed my home. Won't you take pity on me, who came from such glory? yet can never return home, and let me see just one glimpse through your door? Now the watchmen lived cold, empty lives in their cold, empty world, and the name of Denis was already known throughout all the great tree. And so, though they long refused, at last they relented and said to the girl, "We will open the door just a crack, so that you may catch one glimpse of the glory of the great tree, and that too only from the side. But you must tell us first of all the wonders of your city." And the girl told the watchman of Rinerev, of the great library filled with 1,000 links, of the mechanical clocks that looked like planets spinning on their axes, of the lake that was alive and marked the days and nights in the city the way the sun does on other ages, and of the barge of the dead and the barge of silver that had brought her to the library of glass. And the stone watchman opened the door just a little, but the girl could not restrain herself, and stuck out her finger to touch the light that shone forth from the opening. And at that moment the girl was turned to glass herself, a statue standing in the corridor. And there she stands, to this day. That was our first story for tonight. Yeah, so this story is... There are stories also in old bundles from our world that have a version of this story. Usually there are versions of Blackbeard, where there is something horrible behind the door. There is also a version, a Catholic version of Blackbeard, where there is gold behind the door. And that is the inspiration for this tale. And also the idea of magical libraries. It's there in Borges' short stories. It's there in a lot of magical realism. And of course, it immediately reminds me of Denis. So in the story bundle, not that much in the stories for tonight, but in the complete story bundle, there are more magical libraries. Okay. The second story is a little bit different. Denis, of course, is an ancient civilization. It's 10,000 years old. So I thought that the best way to bring that to life is to look for an actual ancient text. And the story that we're going to hear next is a retelling of an episode from the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest story in the world. But this time, a Denis version, even older. The next story in the bundle, The Great Fire, or Rinerev and Utnapishtim. In the beginning, before even Garthané was made, the Maker created a world filled with people. His creation prospered, but they made so much noise and chaos in his ordered tree of possibilities that he soon regretted having created them. And the Maker sent a consuming fire from the stars which destroyed their whole world. But on that world there was one man who followed the Maker's ways. Utnapishtim, the listener, alone was quiet amidst the noise, always listening for the Maker's words. And one night the Maker spoke to him in a dream and said, "Utnapishtim, I have resolved to destroy this terrible world I've created. But you I shall spare, since you alone have listened to my words in the chaos. When you awaken, you will find a fissure beside you like a pool full of stars. Take all you hold dear and jump into that fissure, for by this shall you be saved." And indeed, when morning came, Utnapishtim found on the ground beside him a fissure full of swirling stars. He took his wife, and they both jumped inside. Then the Maker caused the stars in the sky above that world to expand, so that their fires consumed the whole of the age. But Utnapishtim and his wife, he had linked into the void between the ages, where they remained safe from the flames. Now when the fires cooled, the tree of possibilities was silent, ordered, perfect, and empty. And the Maker looked upon the emptiness and regretted having destroyed his world and his people. And so from the void he brought forth paper and ink, and he wrote a new world greater than the first. And he named this new world Garthané, the root of the great tree. And Utnapishtim he made immortal, but Gartane he made mortal. The maker gave the gifts of paper and ink to the people of Gartane and taught them the art of writing. And for many years they flourished, until at last Gartane's appointed hour drew near. And once again all the people had turned away from the maker except only one, a young writer named Rineref. And Rineref saw that his world was dying and cried out, "How can the maker allow this? What hope do we have when all that we know and all that we love can be wiped away with no reason? Are we nothing in his eyes, meaningless creatures, ephemeral as fireflies?" And Rineref sought out all the wise men and great writers of Gartane and asked them why their world had to die, but none had an answer. Until at last a priest said, "Seek out Utnapishtim, the faraway, the only immortal ever created by the maker. He alone knows the secrets of death and of immortality." And so Rineref took up his paper and his ink, all that he had, and set out in search of Utnapishtim the faraway, who lived at the mouth of all rivers and in the middle of every ocean in an impossible place. After many days he came to a mountain impossible to climb, impossible to go around, and through its heart led a tunnel of pure darkness. But Rineref burnt up all his paper to light his way and came through on the other side. Rineref again traveled for many days. Finally he came to the shore of a sea upon which lay the wrecks of a multitude of ships, half eaten through, for the sea was all made of acid. But Rineref poured his ink into the water, and as it spread, it softened the acid, so that the sea became passable. Then Rineref took the planks from the ruined ships and built himself a raft, and with this he crossed the waves. In the middle of the sea stood a lighthouse made all of diamond, and at the top of that lighthouse, instead of a lamp, lay a book that linked to Utnapishtim's age. When Rineref linked, he found Utnapishtim unperturbed, taking his ease on the shore of his island. "Why have you come here?" he asked. "This is no place for mortals. Return to your age and live out your life in happiness. Leave this old man alone, whose world was destroyed, and whose life was erased in the void." But Rineref said, "What use is my life to me? What use is anything, if I and my whole world are to perish, only because the Maker created us mortal and refuses to tell us why?" "Very well," said Utnapishtim, "I'll give you the secret to eternal life if you can stay awake on my island for 5 days and 5 nights. Rineref readily agreed, but within a few moments sleep drifted over him like flakes of soft wool, and he did not wake until the 5 days and nights were up. "Oh, Utnapishtim, what shall I do?" he cried. And Utnapishtim answered, "Will you not learn, you stubborn fool? Do you bake bread to last forever? When you build a house, do you expect it to stand until the end of time? There is no permanence anywhere." But Rineref cried out so miserably that Utnapishtim's wife took pity on him and said, "Don't let my husband know, but there is another key to immortality on this island." And she took him to the other side of the island, where the shore was shallow and swampy, and at the bottom of a tide pool pointed out a heavenly blue flower with 5 perfect shining petals. "That is the flower of immortality," she said. "Give your people to eat of its petals, and they shall never die." And though the acid burned his flesh and the thorns pricked his fingers, Rineref picked the flower, and promptly linked back to Gartane in the utmost joy. "Wait," Utnapishtim's wife cried, "the flower cannot leave this island." But Rineref had linked away already, and so he arrived on Gartane empty-handed and alone, for the flower had stayed behind in the void of the link and was never seen again. And so Rineref was forced at last to confront death, both Gartane's and his own. But the Maker did not leave him without mercy, for he inspired Rineref to write the link to Denis, saving his people. And even the others were saved, for the Maker vowed then, though everlasting life was not for them, never again to destroy his people. And that was the Gilgamesh story for today, retold as a Denis tale of Gartane. The original was the Gilgamesh flood story. Utnapishtim is taken from Gilgamesh. And In this case, instead of Gilgamesh, we have Rinaref. And the episode with the flower is also in the original story as well, where Gilgamesh, at the end of his great epic, returns home to Uruk empty-handed, with nothing, except the wisdom that he learned. Okay, the third story. The third story is about a guildmaster and an apprentice. It's a story of revenge, an old-fashioned revenge story. And what I especially liked about this one is that it involves a great banyan tree. It's a great tree from the Indian subcontinent that spreads around and becomes a gigantic canopy and eventually grows into a massive forest. And that always reminded me of Denis. So I decided to write one into a story. And that is in this one. Okay, story number 3 for tonight. There was once a writer's apprentice who served under an evil guildmaster. Where the apprentice was wise, the master was foolish. Where he was pious, the master was godless. And where he was generous, the master was miserly. The apprentice was blessed with a great gift of writing, and the master knew that soon the boy's fame would eclipse his own. And so, in his envy, he took fire marbles and set fire to his own library, paying some students as wicked as himself to testify before the king that the virtuous boy had started the blaze. For if he continues like this, the master told the students, you'll become more powerful than even your own fathers, and then where will you be? The whole of Aigura ran out to watch the flames tower in the air above the guild hall of the writers, and before long, the apprentice was dragged by a mob to the king's palace, the weeping guildmaster following close behind. I'm innocent, protested the boy. I was never even near the guild hall at night. But the wicked students, fearing the loss of their own good standing, gave their false testimony. And the king condemned the boy to a prison age, never to return to Denis. And so the virtuous apprentice was linked out of the city amidst the cries of a jeering multitude. He found himself alone in a swamp. In the distance he saw a great tree with tendrils hanging down like streamers from a wide canopy of branches, a great green cathedral. And under this tree he made his home. And the days became months, and the months became years. And the tree grew up around him like a great palace, its hanging tendrils thick as columns, its leaves a roof above his head in 1,000 shades of green. One night the apprentice dreamed that the tree spoke to him. In a rustling voice of leaves it said, I was created by the Maker to protect the virtuous. Take heart, for soon your exile will end. Take my bark, take my leaves, and the way shall be open to you. The apprentice awoke to find himself surrounded by fallen bark and fallen leaves. And the bark served him as paper, the sap from the leaves served him as ink, and a broken twig served him as pen. And so, sitting under the canopy of that great tree, the apprentice wrote a link, which, by the grace of the Maker, from whom even the impossible is not hidden, led to Denis. Impossible things can happen in fairy tales. But the apprentice was wise and knew he should not let himself be recognized in the city. But as he has lived many years on his age, and no longer looked like the cavern dwellers, he easily disguised himself as an off-worlder. And so the apprentice linked back to Denis. He carried with him the paper and ink from the tree and stood in the central square of Aigura, where we have Radio Free Denis nowadays. Look upon my inks and paper, good citizens of Denis, he said. See this fine paper, see these fine inks. A crowd soon gathered around him, and the guildmaster of the writers came out to meet him. Not recognizing his former apprentice, the wicked master asked, From what age do you come? I come from an age linked to in secret long ago, said the apprentice. My age is covered in forests, all perfect for paper, springs flowing with ink, orchards full of the sweetest fruit, and among the trees there is game perfect for hunting. And he so extolled the virtues of his age that the guildmaster's heart was set aflame with desire. I must see this age with my own eyes, the master said. To which the apprentice replied he'd gladly show him, and he led his former master to the ferry port, where lay the book to his prison age discarded among old paper. The master, unsuspecting, followed the apprentice and linked through. The two men arrived in a clearing on swampy ground, surrounded by a forest of hanging tendrils from the great tree. 3 giants stood there, each as tall as a tree himself, and in their hands they held great shovels. Today the Maker will punish your wickedness, said the apprentice. Years ago you burned your own books and sent your innocent apprentice into lifelong exile. Today he stands before you to execute justice upon your head. And the 3 giants laid hold of the wicked master and buried him deep beneath the roots of the tree. The apprentice returned to the knee, where the other writers confessed that they had known of his innocence, and they elected him as their new guild master, which he remained until the day of his death. Ending of story 3 for tonight. Fairy tales often can get quite violent and especially often are concerned with revenge and people getting what they deserve, and the Denis fairy tales are certainly no exception. Okay, story number 4. Story number 4 is again, I'm changing one after the other, so every time I start with a grim fairy tale, such as this one and story number 1, and then I change it up with one that is based on an actual ancient text. So here we go back to the ancient world. We go back actually to Bronze Age Egypt, where people wrote novels, actually, which we have preserved a couple of. And one of them is the story of Sinue, a very beautiful story of a man who goes away from his home and finally is able to return. A story about belonging in a place, about love and about longing for home. And of course, as with any ancient story, yes, Walt Disney sugarcoated many of them, that is true. And so did others, especially even long before Walt Disney. The worst offenders are, of course, the Victorians, with Victorian sensibilities, unfortunately, so it's better to leave those be in the 19th century where they belong and take back the ancient stories as they are. Sugar-coated cookies are always good, so those are always a good idea. So, story number 4 for tonight is a Denis version of an old story from the Bronze Age. And who knows, somebody might write some fanfic that has the Denis appear in ancient Egypt and share stories with them, which explains why we have the same story as the Denis. Okay, story number 4. The Return of Sinue, or the Love of Ages. There was once a maintainer whose brother was guildmaster of the writers. He deeply loved his brother, but also felt himself his inferior, for he could only secure and defend the ages that his brother could write. Now the king in those days had a daughter, a beautiful young woman whose beauty outshone the radiance of the lake and all the lights of Igora. Both brothers loved her, but whatever they tried, the woman could never choose between them. The maintainer, though he loved her dearly, could hardly speak his mind, so certain was he that she preferred his brother over him. He began to avoid his brother, and even Igora itself, choosing to spend his time on rugged, uncivilized ages at the far borders of Denis influence. There he grew ever more wild and warlike until even his brother scarcely recognized him. But try as he might to forget his love, her face would not leave his dreams. One day, while on a lengthy campaign, the maintainer's enemies gossiped against him, and it reached his ears that his brother the writer sought to kill him. Having all but lost touch with his brother and with Denis itself, the maintainer had no choice but believe it, and he fled so far into the deserts of that age that not a trace of Denis influence could still be seen. Many days he wandered in the wilderness until the days became weeks and the weeks became months, and finally he reached the village of tents in the desert. There he was welcomed, and he used his skills as a maintainer and his knowledge of Denis to secure his new people's homeland and to teach their children, so that he soon enjoyed great fame and success among the tent people. And the maintainer married the chieftain's daughter and had children of his own. And when the chieftain died, he became the undisputed leader of the desert tribes. And after many years, he convinced himself that he'd forgotten the knee. But the years passed, and one day the maintainer found himself an old man, worn and grey. And his thoughts were drawn back to the knee, and his heart longed for the lights of the lake, to look once more upon the great library. And so he sent a messenger to the maintainer fortress of that age, asking them to remember him and to allow him to return to his city. 2 men came to the desert to bring the maintainer his answer, and they carried a linking book to Igora between them. "We are the sons of the king's daughter, your nephews," they said. "Please link with us. Your mother desires to see you. Our mother." When the maintainer linked, he arrived on the shores of the lake, where he fell to his knees and kissed the flagstones. And the woman stood there, waiting for him. She was grey and withered like himself, but her former beauty still shone beneath the surface. "Your brother died years ago," she said, "but tell me, what has happened to you?" And the maintainer told her his story, of his great love for her and his equally great fear of his brother, of his flight desperately into the desert, of his life among the tents, of his wife and children, though he saw her flinch at the mention of these last. Finally the woman said, "You have told your story, now hear mine. Did you not know how your rash decision would hurt those whom you loved? When the maintainers came to tell your brother that you disappeared, he nearly died of grief. Day after day he waited, and when it finally dawned upon us all that you were lost for good, he broke his pen in two and swore never to write again. And I locked myself away with my grief and refused to see anyone, not even my own father and mother. Finally, after months of solitude, the city forced me to open my door. Men from the Guild of Writers came and delivered your brother up to me, for he was no longer a writer. And your brother asked me where my heart lay. What did you tell him? Said the maintainer, eyes only for the woman as though the years had all fallen away from them, while a growing crowd of onlookers assembled at the shore of the lake. I told your brother that my loyalty, admiration, and friendship were his forever, she said. But as for my heart lay elsewhere. And the maintainer stepped back in shock, regret, and utter disbelief, and so did the whole crowd at the shore. After much delay, they prevailed upon your brother and I to marry, and we have lived happily together until his death, though he left the guild and never wrote another word. Finally, realizing his folly, the maintainer was struck dumb with grief, and the woman took his hand in hers and led him away through the silent crowd. Story number 4. There are multiple versions of this story. One of them doesn't have the love story. That's the oldest one. The maintainer, in this case, in the Egyptian story, is a warrior. He is the brother of Senwosret, pharaoh of the Middle Kingdom, I think, 18th century BCE. And he thinks that Senwosret is out to kill him, so he runs away to Canaan, to the empire that Egypt had in the Levant, where he lives among the people who dwell in tents. And finally he has grown old and seeks to return to Egypt to see the Nile one more time. There's also a very beautiful version, very beautiful retelling, which I prefer over the original. It is the retelling of Naguib Mahfouz. He has a very beautiful modern version of it. Same story, same characters against Senwosret's brother, but this time he is in love with the daughter of one of the warriors, both him and Senwosret. And he thinks that since Senwosret is the heir to the throne, of course, the woman will choose Senwosret and not Sinuhe. And the same thing happens as here. He realizes his mistake after living in the desert for 40 years. Okay, I think we have time for some more. So we again leave distant antiquity, We return to the Grimm fairy tales, although some of those are equally old as the Sinoway story. We just don't have ancient manuscripts for them. To continue with the writer's apprentice. So again, we have a lot of similar themes, just like with fairy tales in our world. You often see poor girls or poor boys, tailors, because fairy tales tend to be told by women. They are told by ordinary people. They are told by working class people, exactly the kind of people who never make it into the historical record, which is why it's very important to have folk tales like this and to keep telling them. And the same thing happens in the Ni. So in the Ni fairy tales, we see a lot of writers, we see a lot of writers' apprentices, we see maintainers, occasional priestesses as well. All kinds of people who lived in the Ni, worked in the Ni, whose names we don't know, whose homes we no longer find, but who were the life and soul of this city. So story number 5, I think we have time for 6, so that is why I'm inserting this one, is again a poor boy who comes from a factory district. So of course Sion only and the DRC only excavated Aigura, but aside from Aigura there were a lot more different sectors of the city, some of which were closed off from Aigura because the people in Aigura didn't want contact with people from other ages, and the people who lived and worked in those districts were poor working class Dani who worked on factory ages. For example, the people who ran the factory on Teledan would have gone home to one of these places. Okay, story number 5, The Writer's Apprentice. Again, a revenge story. Once there was a poor boy who lived in a factory district, a filthy place in the darkness far from the main city. Now in those days there were no minor guilds, and even the schools were only for the rich. But the boy was clever, and he taught himself to read and write from books and scraps he stole at the ferry port. One day a writer passed by the district on a ferry to Aigura, so they had not been blocked yet, and saw the boy writing on a scrap of paper at the harbor. Amazed, he went ashore and said, "Who are you, boy, and who taught you to write?" "I'm the son of a factoryman," said the boy, "and I taught myself, for I do what I want and I fear nothing." The writer was intrigued and took the boy with him to Aigura, where he soon became a talented apprentice. Yet still he said, "I do whatever I want and I fear nothing," for the boy truly knew no fear in his heart. And so one night he went down into the cellars of the guild hall, where the other apprentices dared not go, and there he found a book, bound in heavy iron chains. "Why is that book bound so strongly?" he asked the writer the following morning. That book links to a beautiful age, full of lush forests and clear water and rich soil," the writer answered. "But a witch lives there, who eats the flesh of man, and none who have linked there have returned alive." "Well, I do what I want, and I fear nothing," said the boy. "I'll link there and make it safe." And nothing could dissuade him, now that he had heard of the beauty of that age, so that he loosed the chains that bound the book and linked that very same day, taking with him nothing but his pen, his ink, and some failed books. The boy arrived in a vibrant green forest, a soft carpet of moss and blue flowers beneath his feet, and a crystal-clear brook flowing by his side. He tasted the water and was deeply refreshed, as though all the waters of the Ni were but mud by comparison. "This age shouldn't be locked away," he said to himself, and set about looking for the witch. Before long, he came to a stone cottage in a clearing, with a well-kept garden around it, in which grew crops larger and juicier than any he had seen, even at the guild hall of the caterers. Smoke rose invitingly from a chimney, and an old woman opened the door and called out, come in, I've just finished cooking." The boy entered into a rather cramped dining room, so just like the kitchen here at Elonin yesterday, in which a group of people sat around a large round table, a steaming pot of stew right in the middle between them. Have some, they cried, as they helped themselves to chunks of cooked meat. But the boy remembered what his master had said, and took nothing. Then the man next to him said, "If you won't eat, then leave the table and go sit with my brother in the basement," for he hoped to kill the boy and cook him in tomorrow's stew. "I'll go," said the boy, "for I do what I want and I fear nothing." And down he went, down a flight of stairs into a room all of grey stone, lit by a single yellow flame. Here he saw an iron table fastened to the floor with iron screws and bolts, and at its head sat a giant, whose head reached the ceiling and whose hands were like shovels. "Now I shall cook you," said the giant, and he took hold of a knife fit to cut down trees. But the boy took out a partially finished book, one in whose writing he'd made a mistake, so that its gateway image showed the knee, but it really linked only into the void. Trap books can exist in fairy tales as well. "Before you kill me, take a look first at this city," he told the giant. "Here you will find much better flesh for your fires." And the giant peered through the gateway image and saw a multitude of people rushing by past the Igora ferry port, and his mouth watered at the sight, so that he touched the panel and linked into the void. The boy once again went up the stairs into the dining room, where he found the people fighting and all in disarray. "What happened here?" he asked. "We are fighting over the last drop of wine," a man said, "for we take whatever we want and we do not share. But now that you're here, I think we shall cook and eat you first." And they all took out knives and clubs. But the boy took out his ink bottle and said, "Before you kill me, first taste this wine. It comes from my native land, and it combines marvelously well with meat." And he poured some ink into each of their glasses. And when they drank, they were poisoned and fell down dead. Finally, the old woman came up to him, knife in hand, and said, "You've killed all my children. I'll chop you up and throw you in the river." And she rushed towards him, her chopping knife raised high above her head. But the boy took out his pen, which had a very sharp point. And as the witch rushed forward, she was impaled upon it and died. The boy quickly linked back to the city and told his master, the writer, all that he'd seen and done. And the book was taken to the guild hall of the caterers, so that from that day on, the people of the Knee had crystal clear water and ever abundant fruit. One of the more violent stories in the bundle, and also one in which the morality of the Dni is not entirely without question. Of course, this is an age that they link to. There is a fair amount of cannibalism because the people on the age are probably trolls, and trolls eat people. Then again, the Dni also are the ones who link to this age and decide to kill all the trolls on it in order to take the spoils for themselves. And since all of us have played Myst 5, we might have some ideas about that as well. Okay, I think we have time for one more for tonight. And of course, the previous story is based partially on the story of the boy who knew no fear. So there is a story which I'm not sure if it is in the Grimm's bundle or somewhere else, but I think there are many versions of it about a boy who does not know what fear is. He goes either to a castle where the spirits of the dead come back to life, or he goes to a castle where he has to play cards with the devil and demons come to torment him, or both. I think I know both versions from somewhere. And eventually, still, he defeats all of them, and eventually he learns fear either because his loved one dies or because somebody throws frogs at him, depending on whether you have the tragic version or the funny version. And the previous story was based on that. Okay, the next story, keeping with the theme, is again a story from the ancient world. It's based on a tale told by Herodotus, somewhere, I think, quite early on in the histories. He tells the story of King Croesus of Lydia, who was the wealthiest king in the whole world, in the ancient world, famous for wealth and gigantic amounts of money that nobody could compare. And he is visited by an Athenian sage, an Athenian philosopher called Solon, who teaches him that happiness and wealth are not always the same. And we have a Denis version of that here, involving Rhineref and the king of Garthanay, who is of course wealthy not so much in terms of gold and silver, but wealthy especially in terms of links and books and power over the Tree of Possibilities. So, final story for tonight, The Curse of Fortune, or Rhineref and the King. In the days of Rhineref, a king ruled over Garthanay. Now, Garthanay was linked to millions of ages, many more than we have today, told by a Denis storyteller, somewhere after Rinnerev, probably a long time after Rinnerev, so that it could rightfully boast of being the root and the heart of the great tree of possibilities itself. And so its king believed himself the happiest and most fortunate man in all of the great tree. One day, a man came to Gartane from one of its many ages, and he was known to be a great prophet. The king invited this prophet to his palace and said, "I'm told that you see the truth of many things and understand even what's in the hearts of men. So tell me, who is the happiest soul in the tree of possibilities?" For he was convinced that the prophet would name none other but himself. But instead, the prophet answered, "O king, it is a man called Tellus." This rather surprised the king, who asked, "How so?" "Well, because Tellus was neither rich nor poor," said the prophet, "and he died surrounded by loved ones with no great worries in his life." The king then asked the prophet twice who he thought was next in line of happiness, and on both accounts the prophets named only common men from his own age, who, moreover, were all long dead. "What do you mean by all this?" cried the king, now sorely vexed by the prophet's obstinate refusal to acknowledge his majesty. "You call yourself a prophet, yet you stand here, amidst all the greatness of Gartane, the root of the great tree and the very keystone of the multiverse, and you ignore it all in favor of common dead men from your own age. Am I nothing to you?" "In life," said the prophet, "though a man may seem happy, misfortune may strike at any moment. No man can be judged happy until he dies." But the king called him a false prophet and banished him from Gartane. Many years passed, and at this time it became apparent that Gartane's days were numbered, and the world that had prided itself on being the root of creation would soon perish. And many links were written, and the people all fled, until only the king, too attached to part with his world, remained behind. His court had tried long and hard to convince him to link to Terani with them, but he kept on refusing until they at last gave up and left him behind. And the king sat and wept as he watched the sun pull back in the sky and the stars vanish, while fissures appeared in the earth that tore the world apart. And in the midst of his despair he heard the sound of a link, and looked up to find that Rinnerev, himself once an outcast, had come back for him. And in that moment, as Rinnerev pulled him away from the fire that would scatter his world to atoms and into the knee, the king knew that he was surely the unhappiest man who ever lived, in all the tree of possibilities. And the king called out the prophet's name as he linked weeping into the cavern, and Rinnerev asked, "Who is this prophet you speak of?" "He came to my palace years ago," said the king, "and I cast him out for refusing to say that I was the happiest man in all the great tree. He told me that no man can be judged happy until he dies, and only now do I see that he was right." And Rinnerev embraced the king and welcomed him to Deni, where all could begin anew. And the king became a steadfast friend of Rinnerev, living a simple life amidst the darkness and the stone of the cavern. And there, finally, he died happy. Last story in the bundle, story number 25, Croissants and Solon. The original Rinnerev was Cyrus of Persia, king of Gartane was Croesus, and the prophet is Solon of Athens. And the lesson is the same. Maybe one more we can do. Let's see if it opens it. Headings. Okay. Maybe one more story and then we leave. Thanks a lot, Robert. Have fun. Okay. Or no, let's leave the final story for some other time. Then we still have some time as well to get to the next events. I hope you liked it. Maybe I will also see if I can find some time to maybe do it more regularly. Not only the niche stories, but maybe also some historical fiction. I have a lot of things. maybe some weird fiction, some slipstream or Borges stories. I can also read to you guys some nice short stories that have to do with books and libraries and that were the inspiration for many of these. So I will see if I can maybe have this a bit more regularly, either in Elonin or in Fights High Garden or some other nice place. Thanks a lot, and see you in Calamy. I think in a few minutes we all have time for a cup of tea. Yes, exactly. The story, exactly. The rich and powerful weren't the only Denis. And it's easy to forget that because, well, just like with any piece of archaeology, Igora is no exception in that. Whenever you find things from the ancient world, usually what you find are palaces and temples and pyramids and great ziggurats and things like that, but you don't find the places where ordinary people lived. We don't we have the library of Nineveh, or we had until some time ago, but we don't have the ordinary mud huts that people lived in because they were made of mud and they're all gone. And same with ancient Egypt. We have the temples of Karnak and Abu Simbel and the pyramids, and it's all great and wonderful, but we don't have the houses of the people who built them because they're gone. So it's very easy. And the same thing happens in Denis, that we have Igora, but we don't have all these factory ages. We don't have the home of the guy who ran the factory at Teledan. We don't have the houses of the people who kept the garden at Ereshkigal. But they're all very important people. And they are remembered in stories like this one. Okay, I will see when I can get back with some nice stories, some nice other stories. And yes, exactly, Clyde. That is why these stories are important. And again, I'll maybe post a link to them again into Sign Chat. I have a link to the full collection of stories, all 25 of them. We read 6 of them today. So if you're interested, then you can read them there as well, as some other remixed ancient texts that are on my page. Okay, I think, oh, Paul the Hopper is already running the relaxing show, so let's go to Calamy, guys, and relax. See you soon. I will stop the stream.